Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us today and welcome to the Education, Financing and Learning community. I am Luis Eduardo Perez Murcia. What should I start now? Sorry about the technical issues. This is my first time using this system. So I should start. Hopefully that is okay. Hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today and welcome to the Education, Financing and Learning community. I am Luis Eduardo Perez Murcia, GCE's Policy and Research Advisor, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our roundtable to discuss how members and partners institutions have been protecting education budgets in the post-COVID-19 era. The idea today is to identify lessons learned from GCE's research, advocacy, and campaign initiatives on debt relief mechanisms and education financing. Before introducing the agenda and our guest speakers, I want to highlight that this initiative draws on Global Campaign for Education long-term engagement with debt alleviation mechanisms and tax justice as critical aspects to increase education budgets. Just to give you a background, in 2020, the Global Campaign for Education developed a background paper for our members to engage with the alleviation mechanisms and their potential for financing education, mainly through the swaps. Based on this paper, we conduct collaborative research with 7 of our national members and qualified researches on issues around financing in the year of 2021 and produced 7 national papers in El Salvador, Zambia, Gambia, Georgia, Nepal, Lebanon, and Mongolia. Following this second stage of the project, we developed a comparative paper to identify key trends and develop a toolkit on the alleviation mechanisms for our members to advocate and campaign for either debt alleviation or debt cancellation, depending on their situation. All these inputs inform our campaign on debt. So today is really a great opportunity to discuss whether and how these different pieces of research and advocacy activities have informed our members' advocacy and campaigns work on education financing. And now I am very pleased to introduce our guests. In no particular order, I want to introduce George Hamasunga, the Executive Director, Zambian National Education Coalition. Mrs. Mary Kigaragazzi, sorry for my pronunciation, Research Leader of the Georgian Campaign for Education. Mr. Rangate, Program Manager, National Campaign for Education, Nepal. And Mrs. Achina Mitsumi, Coordinator for the Task and Education Alliance, Action ID International. So what is the agenda for today? We are going to hear an 11 minutes presentation from each speaker. Our 3 national coalitions will provide a general overview of the situation of education financing before the pandemic and a brief description of how the pandemic had been affecting education budgets. Then they will also reflect about whether the countries, their governments, have been mobilizing additional resources for education through mechanisms such as debt alleviation or debt cancellation. And finally, they would share with us how they have been promoting domestic resource mobilization and the alleviation mechanism for more resources for education. And now, following George, Mary, and Rand's presentation, we'll give the floor to Achina, who will also have 11 minutes to provide a general overview of the tax situation in low and middle income countries before the pandemic and how this collection of taxes has been affected by the pandemic. She will also provide an overview of how taxes we used to finance education before and after the pandemic and the important work the Tax and Education Alliances is doing to promote domestic resource mobilization through taxation. So thank you very much all for joining us today. After the 4 presentations, we are going to have questions, and you please feel free to make your comments and questions in the chat box. So over to you, George. You can share your screen, George. Yes, I see the screen. So yes, you have now 11 minutes. I can't hear anything, George.
Sorry, my internet was giving me problems, so I'm just trying to shift and be in another position so that you don't lose me in the process.
Okay, I hear you
Yes,
clearly now.
yes. So I can start now.
Yes, please.
Um, yeah, so I'm going to give just a quick presentation within the time given. Maybe just to introduce that myself, I'm George Hamsunga from the Zambia National Education Coalition. We can go to the next slide. Yes, so in terms of the situation of education financing before the pandemic, it is apparent that Zambia, just like other countries, actually was affected in the sense that the economy could not actually generate enough revenue to invest in the education sector, because most of the taxpayers, including the mining companies, were crippled as a result of COVID-19. So you can see from the graph that during the period, 2020, when COVID hit, Zambia allocated 12.5% of its budget to education, and this dropped in 2021 to 11.5%, and in 2022 it dropped further to 10.4%. And this also as a result of the fact that the country actually at the time, most of the time the schools were closed, and not much investment was envisaged to be given to the education sector during the period, as much of the resources actually went to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. Next. Yes, so in terms of the description of how the pandemic affected education in brief, COVID-19 actually did slow down the economic growth, and it's as a result undermined the country's ability to generate domestic revenue to invest in education. And as a result, Zambia between the years 2020 to 2022 spent an average of 11.5% to education, which was among the lowest. Actually, the allocation for 2022 was the lowest that we had as a country, as a share of the education budget for 15 years. And that is how it affected the education sector. The 10.4%, that was allocated actually is something that could not significantly address most of the issues or allow us to deliver free education. And in 2020 also the funding gap was higher than the actual allocation, as you can see in the next graph. Next. So you can see that in terms of the funding gap, 2020 had the highest funding gap, where the education budget was around 10 billion, which was allocated, but the funding gap in that year was about 11 billion, which means that and you can also see that although the funding gap was highest in 2020, there was some slight improvement in terms of the nominal allocation to the budget, which managed to bridge the budget a bit. Next slide. Yes, so in terms of actions to mobilize additional resources for education, of course, these will be discussed in the perspective of the debt alleviation, as well as progressive, taxation measures that were taken. In terms of debt alleviation, Zambia globally actually is the first country after the COVID-19 pandemic, that managed to secure an agreement with official creditors on debt restructuring. And this actually was, done, under the current, leadership of President Hakainde Hichilema, whose, policies inspired confidence in most of the creditors, to which inspired confidence also in the process of the negotiations, for an agreement, around restructuring the debt. And Zambia, of course, successfully negotiated a comprehensive debt restructuring plan with key creditors, including the IMF, the World Bank, and some bilateral, lenders within this year. And the debt restructuring plan involved several key elements. I'll just mention three, for lack of time. The first was negotiating the date, especially in terms of rescheduling. So, as you may be aware, the Zambia had started defaulting on its debt payments, and therefore one of the key issues that was required was to negotiate the fact that the debt could be paid over a longer time, in order to give, resources, to free resources that should go to the social sectors, including education. The negotiations also involved debt forgiveness and relief. So some countries were able to forgive, their debt, but that is on condition, that that debt was invested in the social sectors, especially in social cash transfers, for instance, to support social security. The agreement also involved policy conditionalities and reforms, especially commitments about Zambia in fiscal discipline, on issues of governance, as well as transparency and accountability in the management of the available resources. And this is what formed part of the negotiations. I cannot go in detail, but I've provided a link there for a very useful research that can help you get more information next. In terms of progressive taxation during the COVID-19, the main measure actually was that government did grant an amnesty on tax penalties during the COVID-19. This actually was a very good and helpful, policy, which allowed most organizations, companies, and institutions that were owing government to focus on settling only the principal amounts that were due to the Zambia Revenue Authority. And all the penalties that they had against their accounts, where they could apply for a waiver, 100% waiver. And this actually saw quite a lot of compliance in people coming forth to try and settle their principles in order for them to benefit from the waiver on the penalties. So this actually was the main policy that enhanced revenue generation on the part of government. Next. Yes, in terms of actions to promote domestic resource mobilization and debt alleviation mechanisms, first, we were lucky that we did generate a lot of evidence during COVID-19. First, we did 3 researches on the impact of COVID-19 that were funded by the Ministry of Education itself through the funding they got from GPE. So they invested in us to conduct researches in 2020, 2021, and 2022, so that we can be advising government on when to open and close the schools and what exactly they needed to do in order to ensure that learning went ahead under the new normal. We also were happy to be one of the beneficiaries, as Louise has said, of the GCE funding that allowed us to do a research on Zambia's debt and education financing, which generated very credible evidence that we also used to engage, government through the Minister of Finance, as well as, Parliament, as well as the Minister of Education, mainly to push, for accelerated, negotiations around debt restructuring as it was constraining, the funding towards the education sector. We also did an assessment of the financing of education and attainment of SDG in Zambia on behalf of ActionAid as part of the TaxAid Alliance. So ZANEC was given the opportunity to conduct that research for ActionAid Zambia, and that actually generated also a lot of insight in terms of where we were by end of 2022, at the end of the COVID-19, in terms of achieving the SDGs, and we used that as a basis, to advocate for increased financing to the education sector. We also, so the above evidence, all of it, of course, was used to engage at different levels, but we also used it to make direct budget submissions to the Minister of Finance when they did calls for the budget submissions, especially to advise around the revenue side of the budget in terms of progressive, taxation measures, as well as, we continuously engaged with the members of Parliament on quarterly basis to provide the performance of the education budget using the evidence also that we had generated. Next. So that is basically the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much for sharing all these very important details about how things are being going in Zambia. So we will keep the question for the end of the session. And now we want to welcome Mary Kagadikse. Over to you, Mary. 11 minutes, please.
Thank you, Luis, and the pronunciation was perfect. And thank you for this opportunity to give me the chance and the coalition to share our experience and to learn from our colleagues and just to discuss this truly urgent issue bothering all the people working on the education field. When it comes to Georgia's experience, I'm sure that it's not a new thing what I'm going to mention, but of course we are struggling with education financing since 90s when we experienced still the biggest collapse of the economic and also educational sector in Georgia. And even though since then the education financing is increasing, still it's still low compared to the other post-Soviet countries in the region and also the EU countries. And of course, this really impacts the overall the quality of the education in the country, which is also proved by different international research as well as the human capital development reports provided by the World Bank. And it was promised, and every single year, of course, the financing of education is increasing. Although it remains low, this is the one issue. And another issue is the how the budget is allocated to the sectors and to the priorities. Of course, the pandemic and simultaneously with the pandemic, substantial rise in the external debt levels really negatively impacts economic growth and undermines the Georgian government's plan to increase the educational financing up to 6% of the GDP by 2022. It was promised under the certain international agreements with EU that this was the benchmark we were targeting, but unfortunately it has not been managed, and we are still in the process as the coalition, of course, to advocate for the planned increase of the budget. And when it comes to the external debt, which became also an interesting topic regarding the education financing, we found out that already Georgian government surpassed its limit for getting the additional kind of debt, government's debt compared to the GDP ratio, which is really urgent, and it's happened like this is the maximum still like 2011, like in last 10 years, which also triggers us and the people who are working in the sector to make this into account while advocating for the increase of educational budgets, and to be more kind of in the watchdog position to make sure that increasing the debt will not affect the public funding of the education sector. And all this analysis only became kind of available for us with the support of GC. And not only this, we managed to analyze the debt correlation with the public funding of education sector, and simultaneously we also managed to analyze the overall funding system of the education in Georgia with another research. And this is like one major direction of our work to kind of set of ground for the data-driven and decision-driven discussions with the policymakers. Another like big chunk of the activities we are trying to make the part of our advocacy campaigns are to build the platforms for the sector and intersectoral platforms as well, to discuss the issues which are not only related to the specifically to the field of education. For instance, when we are talking the impact of the increased debt ratios of the funding of education, of course, it also affects the Ministry of Health, all the public sectors, which are also interlinked, and at the end of the day resulted in the economic and social economic results, which affects the young people of Georgia. And we also try as the coalition to maintain the and to build and strengthen the networks, in this case, the international networks as well, to make sure that we have upgraded knowledge of the certain issues, and that we are the part of the general discussion on the specific topics. And this is why we are extremely grateful for the GC to make these opportunities available for us. And like I said, I'm not going to mention the certain numbers, which is really very much context related in this term. But like I mentioned, the research supported by the GC really undermines the very important insights, and really inspired our strategy for the next year. How can we kind of tackle the issue, and what can be our priorities as the coalition regarding advocating for increasing the budget and the management of budget allocation as well. And I will be glad to answer all the questions regarding this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much. And now I will give the floor to Mr. Ran Gary. Over to you, Ran.
Thanks, Luis. Thanks, GCE, for this opportunity to share the coalition works and experiences in regard to the advocacy and campaigning on education financing, mainly concentrating to the debt-related issues. My presentations will focus more on the how was the situation of education financing even after the pandemic, and what was the situation before. Education financing is not the maybe there is some major priority agenda in terms of the commitment of the government and the real allocation. And most of the education budget, even the household, they are contributing to to the further education, securing their education rights, since the education is the fundamental rights and it is a free and compulsory, but even huge numbers of the parents, they have to pay for to secure their education. And in terms of the education sector plan also, there is a lots of gap to implement the education sector plan in place. So in overall, there is a huge gap in education sector, and COVID-19 it massively affected the education sector. More than 8 million children they were affected, and there was the lots of issue of the digital divide and access of the online educations, especially from the marginalized communities. So because of the lack of the investment on the digital device or online education system, those communities, they were forced to be out of school or out of opportunity of the learning also. Mainly the COVID happened to decline in the educational aid also, and most of the household, they lose their income opportunities, job opportunities, and because of this also, they will tend to go in the deep poverty, and it also impacted in the education rights of the children, and they were not able to cover their educational cost of their children, and that created the wider learning disparities among the rich and the marginalized communities. And this happens to increase the out of school children. Around 2 million children were at that time were out of school. And there was a loss of the human capitals also, in terms of securing the job, and in terms of large number of people, they lost their lives because of the pandemic. And in terms of the economic growth and inflation, you can see that the economic growth was negative during the COVID, and it is improved these days, but it's around 2%. And if you see, the inflation is around 8%, and we can see the situation of economics in Nepal. And if we see the expenditure of the government, so the most of the, I mean, large number of around the two-third of the expenditure was in the current budget, and 12 around 13% was for the capital expenditure, and around 12.5% was for the financing, paying the interest of the loan, and return back. And if we see the efficiency, if you see that the capital expenditure, the ability or the capacity of the government to have the capital expenditure is a very low. And even you see that around the 13%, 38% budget that was allocated for financing, and it was remaining to have to pay back. And it also has impacted in overall economic system of the government. It has had also impacted the education system and education budget. And you see that the around 60 71 around 72% budget, it comes from the revenue, and it's around 14% budget, it's around for the internal loan, and 12%, more than 12% budget of the government is from the foreign loans and foreign grants. So foreign loan and foreign grants, it comes around 13 to 15%. And in terms of the education budget, if we see that this year budget, this has slightly increased in compared to the last years, and even during the pandemic. So government able to allocate the 10% in 2021 to 2022, and this year's it's around 11.27. So it means that it's really the underfinance financing of the education budget in compared to the government international commitment to allocate the 20% of the national budget and 4 to 6% from the GDP. And if we see the overall share of the education budget, 38% budget for the primary and pre-primary educations, and the very low is for the resource and development, and and a large number of the and if we see the gender responsive budget of the Nepal governments, especially the education budget, and the slightly we can see that there is a slight increase in the direct budget of that goes for the gender responsiveness, and there is we see that the it is good that that the directly supported budget has been increased, but large number of the budget it is also for the neutral and indirect supportive budget also, and it shows that still there are lots of the issues to address the budget during the equity and also to ensure the gender in the education. And in terms of the allocation, as per the SDGs, mm, and 31%, this is the very large amount of the budget. It do not go for any SDGs indicators and SDG target and goals, and we can see that the government, it's a good that the government has been able to allocate or harmonize their national budget to the SDG also. And and in terms of the current gap, so in compared to the recent allocation of the government, so it's around the half of the budget is gap in education system in terms of the current allocation. So we can see that the government need to had I mean need to work lots to address those gaps, and so that the right to education that has been guaranteed in a constitution that can be fulfilled. And in terms of the debt scenario, that we can see the graph that the loan, external loan, even the internal loan has been increased. And in compare, if we compare the 10 years of budget from, so it has around double the external debt and loan of the government. And share debt to GDP also has been increased, and currently it is 41.5%. And the recurrent expenditure of the government, they are also financed by the aid and loans. And in terms of mobilizing the additional resources, that half of the education sector, as I mentioned, that even the household also they are forced to pay for the education, means that there is a massive commercialization and privatization of the education system, and there is a lots of donation, and parents need to pay, or lots of fee in different names they have to pay. And collection of the resource from the parents by the local governments also, they collect the fee from different activities. And there is not much the solid discussion around the government level from local to the federal in terms of the domestic resource mobilization, and be fully equipped for securing the education budget from the internal source. So this discussion need to be amplified, but there is a less discussion over the government system. And the indirect tax account around 70% of the revenue collection. And this also that the public, mainly the policy makers, they fear to have a discussion over this agenda, because it's mostly it's not come to the public level and creating the wider sensitizations among the citizen, and they also get aware of this. And in terms of the NC efforts to respond the education financing, so we have been engaged to generate the evidences. so that we have a credible data to advocate with the government system and policymakers, parliamentarians. And also, we have a research on education financing and debt relief in support of GCE, and that was also this was a good research that was, I mean, that helped to be a kind of the advocacy tool to have advocacy during the our education financing campaign while doing with the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Education, and Parliamentary. And also, we do the regular budget monitoring and budget tracking, and of the national, province, and the local budget. What is the current allocation of the budget, and what are the that areas that government need to pay proper attentions to address the financing gap. And we also, based on this research and monitoring and all this policy analysis, we do the evidence-based advocacy with the government system. And also, we build the capacity of the National Education Coalition's member, so that they are, I mean, empowered to have amplify those agenda during their advocacy, even at the local level, and they can raise those agenda during the budget making process of the local government, province government, and federal governments. And the good thing is that we have been able to give a kind of the concrete impact on the education financing campaign. Though still the government, Nepal's education budget is low, but we have been regularly been engaged in this process through the advocacy campaign and research related works. And also, we have collected the exemplary cases, best cases of the local government who have been able to adequate the budget as per their commitment, and that can be the replicable to the other local government level. And also, regular meeting with the revenue authorities and Ministry of Finance, National Planning Commissions, to generate the discourse among themselves, and to point pinpoint the loops and the gaps areas, so that they pay the attention during the policy process and the budget process. And also, they build the local government capacity in terms of the budget process, in terms of the policy process, and so that they allocate the educate education financing. So this is the end of my presentations, and I will be happy to address some of the questions in a later part. Thank you, Luis. Over to you.
Thank you, Ram. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now I will give the floor to Ashina Mutsumi. Ashina, thank you very much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Luis, and thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to hear from colleagues and an honor to speak alongside them. So my name is Ashina Mtsumi. I coordinate the Tax and Education Alliance. GCE is a member, so I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but for the sake of any visitors, the Tax and Education Alliance brings together education actors and tax justice actors to advocate exactly for this better education financing, and those are the members. A lot of what has already been presented touches on what I had prepared naturally, because it's on a very similar theme, but I'll highlight some of the more cross-cutting international figures. Obviously, we know that COVID-19, as much as it was a health crisis, had a significant impact on education. It worsened inequalities in education, especially as schools were closed and incomes declined. So where there was already a divide, it was worsened. And one place we saw this especially was with the digital divide. A lot of learning had to go digital, and where they had those facilities, they could, but where they didn't, they could not. And they were left behind as others kept on. There was a disproportionate impact on girls as well, who then had to focus on care duties and responsibilities. Many times, especially because of the increase in poverty, they were forced into child marriage, and there was a sharp increase in gender-based violence. And this impacts on girls' re-entry to schools once the schools reopened. A study by UNESCO and the World Bank estimated that of all the 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries who couldn't read a simple sentence, that this number had risen from 58% to 70%. And that's a dramatic, rapid increase in a very short span of time. But that just demonstrates the scale of the impact that COVID had on education. And all of this is in the context of less than a decade to go to 2030, which is when we're supposed to realize the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 4 in particular. And coming to financing, there's of course particular impacts because the health pandemic quickly became an economic crisis as well. And we saw that a lot of people were not able to participate in the economy. So incomes were down, and of course, with income being down, tax revenues were down as well. In fact, in many countries, they implemented sort of tax breaks and tax initiatives to enable people to have more disposable income. But that will mean at the same time that the revenue collection will shrink even further. Investment in public education also dropped during this time, understandably. A lot of finance was being redirected towards health, strengthening health systems, but also social security systems, as a lot of people now needed this safety net to cushion them from not being able to earn an income. And even where emergency funds were allocated towards the COVID response and COVID stimulus packages, the research shows that on average, just about 3% of this COVID response funding was allocated to education. And it's even lower in low and middle income countries where the allocation was less than 1%. So there's clear that there's a greater need for investment in education, especially because of the pandemic, but the pandemic has constrained the capacity to invest more in education. And then this is also in the context of a rising debt crisis and austerity crisis. So a lot of countries were already servicing debts and at a place of debt distress. As part of the response to the pandemic, a lot of countries took on more debt to support their response. But as we've seen with the Zambia example, and we can share a lot more information to make that even more clear, as a country's debt servicing goes up, many times their financing for education reduces, and there's this correlation. Similarly, a lot of the countries were then being burdened with austerity measures. So this is where either internal policy choices that they make or with pressure from external actors like the World Bank and the IMF being told that they need to shrink or reduce the public sector wage bill, especially, which will directly impact on teacher recruitment. So for a lot of countries, they already had this legacy of trying to shrink the public sector wage bill, and therefore the sectors that usually get affected by this are healthcare and education. So reducing the number of teachers being hired, and by extension, reducing the capacity of the education system to effectively respond and be resilient in the face of this pandemic, of this crisis. And as much as we know that domestic resourcing is the highest share of education financing, around on average 97%, there is about 3%, it'll vary depending on the specific country, that comes from official development assistance. But a key thing that happened because of the pandemic was that even the share even the share of ODA that was allocated to education shrunk around the pandemic, during the pandemic, or as a result of the pandemic. So obviously these countries are redirecting their priorities towards their own domestic response to the COVID pandemic, and they have to make trade-offs. And one of the areas that they reduced their investment in is support to education overseas. Now, that paints a stark picture, but it's not all bad news, because in the midst of this, we had the Transforming Education Summit and a very bold and progressive call to action on education financing. And we'll look at the details of that in just a moment. But just as a snapshot, we see that if you compare the share of financing that went to education, the black bars being from 2015 and then the gray ones looking at 2021-22 period, all regions showed a decrease in the share of the budget that was allocated to education. Now, the recommended is usually between 15 and 20%. There are regions that were not yet at the 15% mark, but still it reduced. And those that were beyond, for example, East Asia and the Pacific, that was at 16.4%, it dropped to 15.05%. So again, this really impacts negatively on the investment in education, financing for education, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in particular. But back to the good news, the Transforming Education Summit, the call to action on education investment spoke to some of the things that we've highlighted here, particularly. So on tax, for instance, at national level, it's urging governments, emphasizing the importance of increasing the fiscal space for education and reaching an adequate tax to GDP ratio. IMF research has shown that all countries have the capacity to increase this to 5%. And if they did so, it would unlock billions in financing for education. So if all countries took steps to increase their tax to GDP ratios, more financing would be made available for education. And at international level, that we need to facilitate and support a global tax administration framework that enables greater domestic resource mobilization. And that's part of the discussion that's going on now with the UN Tax Convention and the debate between should it remain at the OECD or should it be moved to the UN? That global rules around tax and tax administration be moved to the UN, where it can be a more inclusive and participatory process. And it's a very timely moment for this discussion in particular because it connects to that. On debt, obviously, action needs to be taken to either renegotiate or completely write off debt for countries that where the debt repayments are hampering their ability to invest in education. In particular, the countries where debt servicing is higher than what's being spent on education, these countries need to be prioritized. And finally, on austerity, there's advice to the IMF and other financial institutions to remove these conditionalities that they put on the loans that they give or the advice that they give to governments to constrain or to constrict, to reduce their wage bills, because it is directly in conflict with national efforts to increase financing and resourcing for education. So these are the roadmap sort of that was laid out for how, as a global community, we want to do more to finance education more sustainably, and increase even national resilience in the face of such crises. Because as much as the COVID-19 pandemic is now on the decline, we know that we're still in the midst of a climate crisis. In many regions now, we're seeing political and security crises on the rise as well. And we need to ensure that we have systems that are resilient and able to weather these sorts of shocks. I was asked to share a bit about what the Tax and Education Alliance has done collectively. So there's a lot that has already been covered by the presentations that have already been shared, and I'll highlight two main streams as sort of a summary. And one is research and analysis, and the other is advocacy. Basically, in brief, research and analysis is critical. It's important to generate that evidence. It's important to have those analyses documented and in circulation. First, because then that's what you can use for your advocacy. But secondly, this is how other people connect with the discussion, connect with the movements. They're academics, they're students who are just getting interested in it. And if they can find these resources, first, their skills, their understanding, their capacities are strengthened, but also they can connect with the movement to strengthen that. And there's just a few examples of this sort of thing. Of course, so much has been happening in so many different countries, but I'll just highlight the recent ones from this year. There's an analysis done by Zambia on the impact of the IMF program on and fiscal austerity measures on their free education policy. So they recently increased and scaled up their free education policy, but this has faced certain challenges and impacts because of the financing decisions that the state is taking, both positive and negative. So for instance, as George mentioned, the negotiation of the debt repayment plan really did have a positive impact on education financing, and we saw an increase in how much they have to spend on education. The other is, it's no longer visible in the slide, but breaking out of the bubble to transform education financing, which basically takes the recommendations of the call to action on financing education and unpacks, especially on tax, austerity, and on debt. Recommendations were made on other elements as well, but highlighting these three and unpacking in particular what the state is for GPE countries in terms of their tax to GDP ratio, in terms of their austerity measures, in terms of their debt repayment and how that is impacting their education financing, and what then the GPE and other at national level and other international actors can do to fulfill those commitments that have been made, and by extension lead to more education financing. And that's connected to the next point on advocacy, because all of the research and all of the analysis that's generated should be used. These are tools for the advocacy. So then using them in different spaces for different leverage points to push and advocate for change. One thing that Tax Ed Alliance members are doing and doing really well is just enhancing this connection across sectors. So previously, tax justice actors have focused on that, education movements have focused on that, but lately, and even evidenced by this discussion, there's more effort to connect. There's more effort to break down the technicalities, break down the silos, and to do more together. That's important for the movement itself. It strengthens it. And then an effort to do that for the duty bearers. So the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Finance, and Revenue authorities. First, talking to them. So talking to the Ministry of Finance about the importance of education and allocating resources to education. Talking to the Ministry of Education about the importance of increasing financing. I'm just wrapping up. This is the last slide, I believe. And having them talk to each other so that they can understand the importance. And one of the success stories we have is from some countries, the Ministry of Education being able to make a stronger case to the Ministry of Finance for increasing the budget to education when the Ministry of Finance is developing the budget. And of course, all of this has to be underpinned by connecting with communities, mobilizing the people power, because that's really where the change starts. And that's where the momentum will carry the change through. And that's done through engaging with media, through engaging directly with communities, and a host of other ways. Oh, and my last, something that I'm going to mention here is on the Transforming Education Financing Toolkit. So it really breaks down topic by topic what needs to be done. And I know GCE members are already using this tool, and it's available in a number of different languages. There's advancing the advocacy with the Global Partnership for Education. They have a lot of power and resources within themselves, and they should be able to leverage that to strengthen domestic resource mobilization for education, even if it will mean that a time will come when countries are able to finance their budgets for education without relying on the GPE. That's actually the vision. And of course, the GCE campaigns on decolonizing education financing, but the one that's coming up on the UN Tax Convention. It's important. In fact, it's a success story that the GCE is engaging directly on this campaign, because as we've seen, taxes impact education because they finance and resource education, and we should be involved in discussions and advocacy on tax justice. I was going to end with a video, but because I'm out of time, we can save that for later. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, China, Mary, Ran, and George for this wonderful presentation. So now is the time for the discussion. Just to give people know how does it work, I will ask four questions for the national coalitions and two questions for China, but everyone will have the same time. So yes, you have more time for elaborating your answers, China. So please, colleagues, just stick to the time, 2 minutes each one for the very first question. So the very first question for our national coalition is whether your country is experiencing debt distress at this particular moment, and if so, explain whether the country is in a position to apply for any additional debt relief mechanism. Yes or not? So over to you, Mary. We can start with you this time.
Thank you, Lois. This is exactly what we were actually researching with the support of the GC. And for the context, I would say that, as I mentioned, the debt ratio to the GDP increased. It reached up to like 50% from 33, and it's also it's especially important in the context when we know that Georgia does not fall into the category of the countries that are eligible for so-called debt service suspension initiative created by the G20 countries, which really questions the official statements of the government representatives when they are stating that they have the plan how they gonna reduce and somehow address the issue related to the debt elevation mechanisms. And what's just said also regarding the impact on the education, I absolutely agree with the last presenter. It's what we also learned from the research is that it's very much clear from this economic model which was applied to the data by our consultants. And it would be great if he was able to join our discussion because, of course, he's the expert on the topic. But what we learned is that 1% increase in external public debt affects the financing or public funding of the education with and decrease it with 0.26%. And which means that, as the last presenter mentioned, we really need to be the part of the discussions. And to be very honest, even though we are working on the diverse issues, the remediation action, school meal programs, and all sorts of policy issues of the education, we really never questioned if we own the place in the discussion. And what we learned is that despite of this data, which is very much clear, and the negative impacts, it's also important to notice that the increase in death affects other sectors also in the same manner and even worse, such as health, social, and other social systems, and which on this end affects education sector. So overall, even though the economic model shows that the negative impact is like 0.26%, it might increase if we consider the impact of on the other sectors as well. So I think this is like the very briefly on these specific aspects, and of course we can discuss on different questions. And I'm eager to listen experience of other colleagues as well, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Now over to you, Rain. The same question, Ran. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Luis. So, in terms of Nepal, so as I presented during my slides also that the GDP, the debt ratio also increasing, and if we compare the 10 years and around it was the 22 to 41% now. So but the government so they are not much open for the discussion or to make it more the public debate, so it has not been well debated. And the Nepal is also covering its recurrent cost of education budget through external and internal aids and loans, and which is not the sustainable source of the financing. And also the economic growth, even during the COVID pandemic, was the below and the average, maybe the minus, and the inflation was the high. And because of that, so we can say that there is the distress. But we are researching on these topics, and so how the government wants to address this issue, and so we are doing the research over it. And but the Nepal has applied for the debt service suspension initiatives. This is DSSI, which indicates that Nepal government also wants to have some kind of relief mechanism for the debt. But so far, in terms of the repayment mechanism, and in terms of the capability to manage the debt in within the system, that we can say that the government is able to manage. But so the loan and debt, it has been increasing year by year. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Ran. Over to you, George, to reflect on this further on the same question, because you already mentioned that during your presentation. You are mute, George.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Luis. Just to indicate that, Zambia is among the countries that were lucky in 2005 to be forgiven debt. And up until 2011, our economic situation seemed manageable, and borrowing was actually at less than 10% of GDP. But, the new government that came in 2011 embarked on an ambitious agenda for massive infrastructure development, and they sought funding from external sources, especially from China, from the Euro bond market, and commercial banks. And as a result of that, by 2011, of course, our external debt stood around 3.5 billion, or 15% of GDP. But by the end of 2020, Zambia's debt was around 11.9 billion. As we speak now, our debt is around 19 billion. And one of the Eurobond repayments actually was due for payment in 2020. And as I said earlier, we were unable to pay back because we had low liquidity. We couldn't afford. And this is what made us to intensify the negotiations for restructuring dates. And of course, we are expected to complete the negotiations with private lenders that we have not yet concluded, but majority of them have actually given us a breather. And as a result of that, because we have not paid debt since 2020, our education budget actually has increased, for instance, from 13 billion in 2021 to the projected 27 billion in 2024, meaning that by end of next year, in terms of the size of the education budget, it will have doubled. And that is how much we have benefited as a result of this. But before that, you need to get to know this, that debt was getting 40% of our budget. And non-discretionary expenditure, such as management and administration, was getting 50% of our budget. And we are remaining with only discretionary expenditure of 10% of our national budget, which we could invest. And this is how dire the situation really was. And now that we have restructured, and now the obligations we have can make us sustainably service the debt, and also enable us to invest in the social sectors, we are better placed now to, create, an enabling environment for the delivery of quality education. You might wish to know that as a result of these resources, Zambia also in 2022 declared free education from ECE to secondary education, and they calculated parents were level, and this money is front loaded, in a good time to schools directly from the Ministry of Education, meaning that schools now have seen an increase in funding of about 300% in the last 2 years. And this is what, this, debt restructuring has done to our sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George. Now I have a question for Ashina. Taking advantage of your really, incredible experience on issues around taxation, we want to ask you whether and how can progressive taxation be a solution and contribute to generating more resources needed for education financing? Over to you, Ashina.
Thank you so much for that question, Luis. So on whether it can be a solution, the answer is absolutely yes. The how is the part that now requires us to unpack and think together and strategize. In the publication that I mentioned, Breaking Out of the Bubble, that analyzes the GPE countries, it found that 70% of GPE partner countries have a low tax to GDP ratio, meaning that even if they allocated 20% of their budgets to education, they would still struggle to deliver universal education. So there is an urgent need to increase the size of budgets. And this is where tax comes in. Because when we take the necessary measures to increase the tax to GDP ratio, increase how much revenue countries are raising, then we increase the size of the entire budget so that whatever slice that education gets is also bigger by extension. And that's what we need as a necessary first step. If they increased by just 5%, this could raise up to 93 billion for education every year. And this is not even the entire amount. This is if we only allocate some of what is raised to education. So there's huge transformative potential there. And it needs to be the priority because, as we've already mentioned, the bulk of financing for education comes from domestic sources. And the most effective, efficient, most capacity of resources raised at national level is through taxation. Although we also have to caveat that it needs to be progressive taxation, because if the taxes being applied are regressive, then it will actually do more damage. And progressive taxation, this is tax on big multinational companies, it's tax on the wealthy, it's income tax that's graded according to how much a person is earning. And it is not VAT, for instance, that applies a standard across to everyone, although there are ways that it could be done progressively. But for the most part, value-added tax is regressive. Taxes that target the informal sector, these are regressive. So the way that the tax is applied also matters for how transformative it then can be for education. Connected to that, obviously, is the rest of the 4 S's that we all know well, that once we advocate for more taxes and more money is in the budget, we then need to ensure that the share is still, the fair share is still being allocated to education. Not that now we've raised more money and then more is being spent towards militarization, for instance, as happens with a lot of countries. So making sure that it is allocated to education, following through with the scrutiny to make sure that it is then spent in the way that it's supposed to be spent. A lot of countries still struggle with losing a lot of resources, corruption, misallocation, and this sort of thing. So following up to make sure that it's used the right way for it to then be transformative for education. So it requires, tax is great, but it's a first step. A lot more needs to be part of that package. I could say more, but I'm not sure if...
It's okay, Ashina. Thank you very much. So now I am going back to the national coalitions and we are going to the next question. You already had mentioned that, but I would like to hear more about how research really helped the national coalitions to campaign and advocate for education financing. So the question is whether and how had your coalition used the debt alleviation mechanism piece of research to advocate and campaign for increasing funding for the provision of education. So we can keep the order. So Mary, over to you.
Thank you. That's really kind of interesting question for us, because we really struggled, to be very fair about this, how to advocate and how to make all these numbers and all these issues very much reasonable and interesting for the broad audience of the sector. So the first thing what we already did is to kind of translate all these numbers for the our media partners, like making it more visible, simple, and so like this is the way how we kind of establish partnership with them. So when the media is interested, it's already quite easy for us to track the progress and everything. The second thing is that exactly what Ashina was saying about the big picture. So one thing what we are always doing is fact checking what's said and what's done. And we already heard quite many times from our government representatives that the budget is increasing. And like exactly like a few days ago, we calculated what are the real increase, considering the effect of pandemic, considering the inflation, all like increasing debts, and we realized that the overall available money for the education sector is even less than it was in 2015. And another important issue, which is also we often also hear that the funding is increasing for economy, for innovation, for science. When we see the misallocation in the funds and the funding for this particular sector is under 1%. So another important direction of our advocacy is to make sure that on the one hand, when we ask for the increase of the education financing, that we get some kind of proves that this is a real increase, not just increasing the salaries of teachers, which is like the huge part of the whole financing scheme. The second thing is to make sure that the issue what we are discussing is also part of our other campaigns, because it's like cross-cutting. For instance, right now we are talking about the school and advocating for school meal programs, and we also hear that the money in this sense and financing is not the issue, and we are demanding publicly in the shows, in the discussions, that to get the answers, what are the financing scheme and how it is related to the overall, like the overall funding scheme of the sector, and if the risks is really analyzed and mitigated when it comes to debts, and when it comes to other issues which was discussed by our colleagues. So right now this is how we are kind of splitting the data from the research, or reanalyzing and using both internally into our programs and externally when we are working with the education policy makers, both to the parliament and to the parliament committee, as well as with the Ministry of Education. And another important aspect, actually, which I forgot to mention, is that this research also helped us and triggered us to see what is actual budget. I mean, how the actual budget is consisted. And to be honest, it's really kind of difficult to believe, but country does not really have the scheme which shows what are the amount of money which schools or early childhood education centers are receiving, because we have like double funding schemes from national and from central and local governments, from these autonomous centers, and it's also not splitting among the grant loan and other kind of financing schemes. So all those was thanks to the particular research and the working process, which was triggered by this. Hopefully I answered the question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary. Now, Ran and George.
Yeah, thanks, Luis. So, in regard to use this research during our advocacy campaigning, we did in a kind of the two way. One is with the policymakers, and one with our public and the coalition members. For using as advocacy tool while doing the advocacy and campaigning with the policymaker, especially the Ministry of Finance and Revenue authorities and debt management authorities and the Ministry of Education. We prepared the research brief because the main research was lots of informations and data, and we prepared the brief with key findings and key recommendations, and that was the used during the budget making process of the government and also the parliament debate. So we distributed the brief to all the parliamentarian so that they raise the issue during their delivery in the parliament. And also we distributed the research brief to the all the policy makers like the as I mentioned, the Minister of Finance and Education Ministry. And in terms of the within the coalitions and even to inform the public, we prepared the infographics and to covering the major findings and recommendations so that the public can easily go through this and they understand the issues of the debt and tax also, because this is quite, it is taken as a technical, and the public they are avoided to take part in the discussion. And we translated this into the Nepali also, and we build the capacity of our member because we organized the workshop, and the session was to inform about the research finding, what is the situations of the debt, the taxation and domestic financing, and how can we do the advocacy in the local level and the province and the federal level based on the role and responsibility of the different governments. And also we as mentioned by Mary, so the media also was one of the key actors to disseminate the finding of this research. And because as some of the coalition members, they are from the media, and we did the collaboration with them, and they played the active role to disseminate this. And also we massively mobilize our social media like Facebook, and through this also, because lots of the member they are connected in this NC page, and we disseminate the information through the media also to inform the public and policymaker both. Thanks, Luis.
You're muted, Luis.
Thank you, Sheena. So I was saying that we are running out of time. So over to you, George, hopefully in 1 minute to give Sheena the opportunity to close the session with the last question.
Yes, Lois. Just to indicate that, like I said, I think was very critical.
I can hear you, George, but I don't know if that is only me. Can you hear him, Mary, for example? No.
What I was saying is that in terms of the quick, in terms of the quick things that we did, I would like to say that one of them is that we disseminated the report, of course, to policymakers. We did a policy brief as well, which we presented specifically to the Minister of Finance at the time. We also did, benefit from our alliance with the Tax Aid Alliance. I must say the past 3-4 years I think have been brilliant, because most of what we did in terms of issuing statements, in terms of putting together resources and leveraging on the opportunities, for instance, for media that others had within the Tax Aid Alliance to try and, strengthen our voice around date and the taxation in general. I think we did very well, and that is one of the things I think that that we benefited a lot in, that we offered each other platforms whenever there were opportunities to ensure that we take forward our advocacy. So basically that's what I can say under the limited time that I have. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much. And now, Achina, the question for you: whether and how progressive taxation and then valuation mechanisms can complement each other to increase financial resources for education.
Thanks for the question, Luis. I'll try to keep it to a minute. But again, I think it is in fact very possible, and the best thing that we can do is leverage these two to complement each other. First, it's obvious what a negative impact the debt situation has on education financing. And it's striking from what George has explained, this infrastructure fundamentalism that led to this heavy debt burden. There's a whole discussion around illegitimate debt, debt cancellation. And I think that should be part of what we're thinking about, because there's a lot of debt that we should not have to pay back. At the same time, once we release that burden of the debt, then the taxes that are being generated can be used towards what the people need. And that's education is one of the critical needs. Education can also, increasing the tax resources, increasing how much revenue we're raising, can also diminish the need to rely on debt for a lot of these services, for a lot of these developments, right? So it makes a lot of sense that the tax can help us not need the debt, but once the debt is off our backs, also we can do more with the tax. And I think it's connected to GCE's campaign on decolonizing education financing, because a lot of countries that are burdened by debt have other powers, other countries stifling their ability to have this independence, because relying now on domestic resources gives them this independence, this autonomy to take the decisions and have the priorities that they want to have. So I think it also contributes to shifting the power imbalance. And it's critical to make this connection across the discussion with education financing, with the debt situation, and with the tax discussion, because I think there's a good synergy that can be transformative there. Thank you.
Brilliant, China. What a way to just end in our session. Thank you so much. I want to thank you all on behalf of the Global Campaign for Education. Thank you very much for making time for this, for sharing your knowledge, for addressing our questions. And thank you all the people who joined the event. So please keep in touch and continue learning and advocating for the right to education, more financial resources for education. And I want to finish the session by thanking my colleague Kuselwa, who had been behind the scenes preparing all this stuff. Thank you, Kuselwa, and all GCE staff for supporting this process. Have a lovely rest of the day. I don't know the time now where you are, so enjoy the rest of the day. See you later. Thank you for everything.
What do we want? What do we want?
Sorry, for video. Wait for video.
When do we want it? Now!
Brilliant. And now, please, those who have made some time, we can show also another video. Kusaldo, are you ready to show the video? Please don't leave the room. Keep for the next video. Thank you.
I like going to school because school is fun.
मैं बहुत पढ़ना चाहता हूँ और मैं सब्जी बेचना नहीं चाहता और मैं सॉफ्टवेयर इंजीनियर बनना चाहता हूँ.
Que lo que quiero ser.
Je vais à l'école pour étudier, pour réussir, pour aider mes parents quand je serai grand.
Ce que mon père fait pour moi, je veux faire plus pour mes enfants.
I wake up to see my friends not being in school. I wake up to see my younger ones not being in school, simply because there is poverty, simply because there is insecurity, simply because there is lack of funding in the education system.
La exclusión, la falta de acceso, los profesores que hace más de 10 años no han sido formados, que no están a la altura de la tecnología, presupuestos reducidos y una infraestructura ahora sí totalmente destruida.
Dans la salle où nous sommes, la première pluie, quand il a plu, nous, on ne peut pas tenir de cours parce que ça suinte un peu partout. Regarde, de la classe, on peut voir le ciel.
Tenemos otro problema, el otro desafío es la gratuidad de la educación.
The challenge is the money for the registration for school and the school fees.
मेरे वालिद साहब ने कहा कि मैं घर का खर्चा बर्दाश्त करूँ तुम भाई स्कूल का, तो मैंने वालिद साहब से कहा कि मैं एक सब्जी वाले के साथ एज अ लेबर काम करूँगा, लेकिन मैं एक लोकल स्कूल में दाखिल होऊंगा और मैं स्कूल के अखराजात खुद उस दुकान से पे करूँगा और अपनी तनख्वाह से पे करूँगा। तो वालिद साहब ने कहा
tiene mucho trabajo infantil, ¿verdad? Niños que andan en las calles, los niños más grandes cuidando a los más pequeños, entonces estos niños no accesan al sistema educativo.
वर्ल्ड बैंक का एस्टिमेट ये है कि अराउंड 1 मिलियन बच्चा जो है 22 मिलियन ऑलरेडी आउट ऑफ स्कूल था और उसमें ये 1 मिलियन जो है ऐड हो गया है बच्चा।
जी मैं पढ़ लिख कर टीचर बनना चाहती थी, आगे कोरोना की वजह से मैं स्कूल नहीं जा रही, जिस वजह से मुझे
बच्चियाँ ज़्यादातर ड्रॉप आउट हुई हैं और ये इम्कान बहुत ज़्यादा कवी है कि बच्चियाँ वापस स्कूलों में नहीं आएंगी।
So I think it's important that we include young people in policy making and also in the decisions that we make that affect them directly.
मैं सदर से ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि जो है स्पेशल बच्चों के लिए जो है फ़न और तालीमी इदारे बनाएं और उनके लिए जो है ये कोशिश करें कि उनको भी ये फ़ंड दें और वो भी कुछ बनकर निकलें।
La mayoría de las universidades están privadas en un país donde el 70% de la población no tiene los recursos económicos para poder pagar una universidad a precios exorbitantes.
Doter les écoles en matériel, mais aussi penser un peu au personnel et la formation du personnel et ensuite la rémunération.
Se supone que el gobierno debe de garantizar una educación pública y gratuita y de calidad, pero no tenemos ni siquiera maestros en las escuelas.
Señor Presidente de la República, señores donantes internacionales, necesitamos ayuda. Hoy más que nunca necesitamos ayuda.
I think it's high time for us to take education and put it in our priority list.
Los líderes mundiales y de los países que tienen mejores condiciones económicas deben de cumplir con los compromisos de ese porcentaje asignado a la educación.
La demande est forte.
Funding is very important.
Ensemble, j'ai l'habitude de le dire, on est plus fort que tous les obstacles. Ensemble, on est plus intelligent que tous les problèmes.
We must invest in our future. We must invest in children.
Podemos realmente dejar un mundo sostenible, dejar un mundo libre de guerras, libre de discriminaciones, del racismo, de los prejuicios también que existen.
Ensemble, qu'on puisse nous battre pour qu'il n'y ait plus un seul enfant qui ne sache pas lire, écrire et qui ne soit dans aucune offre éducative. C'est un droit et son effectivité doit préoccuper tout le monde.